Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History by podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Warren Carter. And today's discussion is based on his two-volume book on the commentary on Matthew. And I'll have the link to both volumes in the description below and the pinned comment. And that being said, Warren, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure, Jacob. Good to see you.
Likewise. So to start us off, what is distinctive about your approach to the interpretation of Matthew's gospel? How do you tackle the matter?
Yeah, I think this is an important question. Is this just another Matthew commentary, of which we have plenty already, or does it offer something distinctive? And I think it offers something distinctive in this way, that I place the gospel in relation to three significant socio-political contexts in the late first century world. The first of those is the post-70 context of the city of Antioch, which was capital city of the province of Syria, probably the third largest city in the Roman Empire. Now, we don't know for sure that the gospel was written there, but it's a reasonable guess on the basis of a few clues. But typical of larger cities in the empire, Antioch was marked by significant extremes of wealth and poverty, with many of its residents struggling on a daily basis for survival. City marked by overcrowding, food insecurity, ethnic tensions, social resentments of the hierarchy and the advantages for a few at the expense of the rest. Most of the folks engaged in manual labor, new lives that were marked by diseases and sickness, especially of deprivation and contagion from poor nutrition and ignorance of basic hygiene. And so coming out of this context and addressing this context, the gospel engages its audience to shape their identity and lifestyle as followers of Jesus, basically as a missional transforming presence in the city. The second context that I engage and see the gospel engaging is the all-pervasive presence of Roman power, the Roman Empire in the city. The gospel is written in the shadow of the Roman defeat of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple in the year 70. Roman forces broke into Jerusalem after sieging the city for a year. Sieging a city basically meant starving its inhabitants, either into surrender or into death. They burned the temple, they looted, they raped, they killed, and they destroyed much of the city. This was a huge event for late first century Judaism. The gospel interprets it, particularly in chapters 21 and 22, as punishment on the Jerusalem elite for crucifying Jesus. And they're picking up, of course, a Hebrew Bible topos and using that particular understanding of a historical event. Other Jewish texts from around the same time interpret it as a punishment as well, but obviously for different reasons, not the rejection of Jesus. But Antioch had played an important role in that war. Initially, when revolt broke out in 66, the governor of Syria had moved south with troops to try to quell things, but he'd got run back into town. He did not go well, and his campaign was not very successful. So the Romans appointed another guy by the name of Vespasian, who would become emperor eventually. And in 68, after marshalling his troops at Antioch and provisioning them, he swept south through Galilee to Jerusalem and eventually took the city in 70. After the war, the victorious General Titus staged games and parades in Antioch. He paraded Jewish captives and slaves. He paraded loot from the temple. Clearly actions that shamed the sizable local Jewish population in the city. Leading inhabitants of Antioch tried to get Titus to expel Jews from the city, but he declined to do so. But the Roman Empire was not just about military actions and outbreaks of military violence occasionally. It asserted its power through political, economic, ideological, societal controls, structures, webs of power. You know, when you got out of bed in the morning, you stubbed your toe on empire, whether you wanted to or not. You lived in its hierarchical, patriarchal, societal structure that benefited a small ruling elite at the expense of most of the population. Small percentage lived quite comfortably. The rest of the folks lived with degrees of poverty on a daily basis. And so the gospel engages this world by telling the story of one who is crucified by the Romans, negotiates claims of Roman sovereignty, of divine commissioning, of hierarchy, and it exposes the injustices and the inequities of that Roman system and its damages to much of its population. The Roman Empire was bad for your health, and the gospel shapes a community of followers who live in the midst of this empire, sometimes imitating it, sometimes accommodating to it, sometimes trying to make some changes, and sometimes resisting it. The third context, so we're in the large city of Antioch, we have the pervasive Roman presence. Third context that I put the gospel into conversation with is that marked by and constantly in conflict with other members of a synagogue community. I think the Jesus folks are still part of a synagogue community. They're still debating and sorting out the way ahead after the traumatic destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70. I think the gospel identifies some of the matters that are up for debate in those discussions or arguments. Where is divine presence to be encountered? How is atonement to be encountered now without the temple? How's the divine will to be known? And how does one live in the midst of this, in the consequences of this catastrophic defeat as a conquered and shamed people? And the gospel offers a one-word answer. The answer is Jesus is the way ahead. So there's a lot of conflict in the gospel between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, I think for a couple of reasons, one of which is that folks in the synagogue don't find the Jesus answer to be particularly compelling. After all, he was crucified by the Romans, so that didn't seem to be a particularly smart move to ally with such a character. And he was reported to have said that he was coming back to destroy the Roman Empire. So, if you're trying to recruit followers, that's hardly a compelling argument to be making. But also we know that in contexts of the assertions of imperialized power, imperialized groups often understand that they can't fight back against the imperializer, that the imperializer has too much power. So what happens to the anger and the indignities and the humiliations that take place? Well, often in imperialized contexts, it goes horizontally. Instead of being directed vertically to the oppressor, it gets directed to other imperialized groups. And the aggression and the hostility and resentment is expressed towards them, sometimes in verbal violence, sometimes in physical violence. This is a well-known phenomenon that's been identified, and I think we have evidence for that in the gospel as well. So I'm offering a reading that takes the societal context very seriously. Life in a big city with all its stresses and challenges, pervasive Roman power, and conflict within a synagogue community.
How does Matthew's gospel portray Jesus overall? Is it similar to how Mark does, or are there some differences?
Yeah, I think there's some significant differences from what Mark does. I think the fundamental category is that of Jesus being an agent, the agent of God's saving presence and purposes. The opening verse of the gospel identifies him as Christ, that is one who is anointed or sanctioned by God to do a particular job. Priests were anointed, prophets were anointed, kings were anointed. So Jesus is Christed or anointed, sanctioned, and his job description comes a few verses later, chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. We find out that his commission is to manifest God's saving presence. The angel tells Joseph that Mary's going to have a baby, but also Joseph doesn't need to go out and buy a book with a lot of baby names in it, because those names have already been chosen. And so he is to call the baby Jesus. Why? Because he will save his people from their sins. And then 2 verses later, he's to be known as Emmanuel, which means God with us. So putting the two together, he is to manifest God's saving presence in the line of Abraham, because he's identified also as a son of Abraham, through whom God blesses all people, and identified as the son of David, who exercises rule on behalf of God. Subsequently, he's also going to be identified as Son of Man, a term from Daniel, for example, exercising God's rule and purposes. And I think this commission at 1:21-23, this naming of Jesus, is really important because it stands over the whole of the gospel. Everything thereafter in the telling of the story is framed in terms of manifesting God's saving presence. So when Jesus announces the kingdom, or the empire of God, as I prefer to translate it, when he calls disciples, when he heals, when he has exorcisms, when he feeds folks, when he eats with outsiders, when he teaches, when he's crucified, when he's resurrected, all of this is framed by, subsumed by this commission to manifest God's saving presence. And I think it's important to recognize that in this regard, the gospel is quite different from Paul. For Paul, the locus of God's power is crucifixion, resurrection, and return, those three events, with little attention to the activities of Jesus' ministry before crucifixion, resurrection, return. That's not so here in Matthew. The whole of Jesus' activity is framed as a manifestation, as a display, as a revelation, as an encounter with God's saving presence. We don't get that sort of setup in Mark's gospel.
In what major ways does Matthew's gospel rewrite Mark?
Matthew is almost twice as long as Mark. So we have 28 chapters in Matthew and we have 16 chapters in Mark. So there is clearly some significant rewriting. The first piece of major rewriting comes in the first 4 chapters of Matthew's gospel. It's really interesting that for Mark, the account of Jesus' public ministry starts at verse 14 of chapter 1. So there's very little build-up. There's very little introduction, and Jesus is into it at verse 14 of the opening chapter. Not so in Matthew. Jesus doesn't begin his public ministry until chapter 4, verse 17. So some 85 verses of build-up before we get that public ministry underway in Matthew. So there are really some significant things that are put in place in those opening chapters. It's a very slow, long build-up. We start with the genealogy, which I know is everybody's most exciting passage to read in the gospel, but places Jesus in continuity with Israel's history with God. There's no replacement here. There's no culmination. Jesus is placed in continuity with that tradition. Then we have the conception story, which I've just mentioned, and the commissioning of Jesus to manifest God's saving presence. Then in chapter 2, we've got opposition and antagonism toward Jesus. So in the form of Herod, who is a Roman puppet king appointed by Rome to exercise Rome's rule. And so we have that story with the Magi and Herod. Once we get the public ministry underway at chapter 4, verse 17, immediately after that, we go into the Sermon on the Mount, which is the first of 5 big teaching blocks of material in Matthew. So the Sermon on the Mount is 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7. We don't have that material in Mark. Mark refers a number of times to Jesus' teaching, but often doesn't provide any content to that teaching. And this is one of the big makeovers that I think we see in Matthew's treatment of Mark. So 5 through 7 gets added, then another big teaching block in chapter 10, which is about mission activity. There's no parallel in Mark. Chapter 13 is a parables chapter. In Mark chapter 4, we have a collection of 4 parables. Well, now in chapter 13 in Matthew, we have 7 parables. Then there's another big chapter, chapter 18, which is about the community life of followers of Jesus. No parallel in Mark. And then chapters 24 and 25 in Matthew, which is the eschatological or the end of this age, new age material, which doubles Mark chapter 13. We've also got to include in there somewhere Matthew 23, which is this terrible chapter of the scathing woes on the scribes and the Pharisees. So that's a big addition of material, a significant rewriting of Mark by adding all this teaching material to the gospel. And then we end up with the resurrection story. Again, for Mark, we get 8 verses of resurrection story in the original ending of Mark. In Matthew, we get 20 verses, so we've got an expanded resurrection story. So expansions is particularly at the beginning and the end of the gospel, but also with these big blocks of teaching material in the middle.
How does Matthew correct Mark's mistakes?
Well, we can certainly see a number of ways in which the writer of Matthew's Gospel edits or redacts or corrects or makes changes to Mark. I'm not sure I'm always happy with this language of correcting, because each of the Gospels has its own particular perspective. But I've identified some of the significant additions already. For example, the correction of the teaching without content in Mark becomes teaching with a lot of content in Matthew's Gospel. It's one of the reasons that Matthew's Gospel was so popular in the early church, that it contained all this teaching material. We see other changes. We see some stylistic changes to the style, the way the Gospel is written. One example, for example, Mark chapter 1, we have a story of the healing of the guy with the skin disease, which in Mark's version takes 97 words, in case anyone's counting. Whereas in Matthew, when the version of the story turns up in chapter 8, we've got only 61 words. So it's been reduced by a third. One of the ways that Mark joins sections together or pericopes together is with the little phrase, and immediately. There's a real sense of urgency and rush in Mark's Gospel, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately Jesus is doing these things. It occurs some 40 or so times in Mark's Gospel, and most of those are removed in Matthew's Gospel. The whole pace of the action is slowed down, and connections between scenes are made in other ways. Another way of doing the same thing is that Mark often tells the story with the present tense. Jesus goes, Jesus comes, Jesus says, Jesus does, present tense verbs. And a lot of that is also changed in Matthew to past tenses. And so the narrative loses something of that vividness and haste in Mark's story. But beyond that, there are also changes to characters in the story. Both Jesus and the disciples get a major makeover in Matthew's telling of the story. For example, in Mark chapter 6, Jesus in his hometown cannot do any mighty works because of unbelief in Mark chapter 6. Whereas in Matthew chapter 13, he can do some mighty works, but not many. So he's not totally impeded by unbelief. In Mark chapter 8, the Pharisees come to Jesus and ask Jesus for a sign. And in Mark chapter 8, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. So I guess that's a way of saying he rolled his eyes and he was very exasperated. But when Matthew has the Pharisees asking Jesus for a sign on 2 occasions, there's no reference to sighing deeply in his spirit. It's not always a particularly charitable response, but that sighing deeply is edited out. Scenes where Jesus doesn't seem to know what's going on get changed in Matthew. So in Mark, the woman with the hemorrhage comes to Jesus, touches Jesus' clothes, and Jesus feels power going out from him and immediately says, "Who touched my clothes?" Doesn't know. Whereas in Matthew's version of the story, Jesus immediately turns and recognizes her and has good words for her. Jesus knows what's going on. Twice in Mark chapter 9, Jesus comes to the disciples who are in a group and says to them, "What are you discussing? What are you talking about?" Whereas in Matthew chapter 17 and again in chapter 18, we have the same sort of situation. Jesus comes to a group of disciples, but doesn't ask that question. He seems to know immediately what's going on. He doesn't need to be filled in. So we get a makeover of aspects of Jesus. We get a makeover of aspects of the disciples. Everybody knows that in Mark's gospel, the disciples are not particularly intelligent or understanding or perceptive. They're not always the best students in the class in terms of recognizing what's going on. And a lot of that gets edited out in Matthew. So in Mark chapter 4, the disciples don't understand the parable. Well, in Matthew chapter 13, they do understand the parables. In Mark chapter 4, when they're in the boat and there's a storm and Jesus is asleep, they wake him up with an accusing question. "Don't you care that we're perishing?" Well, in Matthew's version of the story in chapter 8, that accusing question gets removed, and the disciples come to Jesus as good disciples with a liturgical cry, "Save us, Lord, we're perishing," quoting Psalm 63. They know where to turn for help. They don't have to make an accusation. 4 times Jesus says to the disciples in Mark, "Have you no faith?" But in Matthew, no faith gets turned into little faith. So they have some room to grow, but at least they're on the way. This one's particularly nasty, I think. In Mark chapter 10, James and John come to Jesus and ask him to do whatever they want from him, whatever they want him to do. And then they go on to say, "Well, we want to sit on your right hand and your left hand in your kingdom, in your empire. We want the positions of power and prominence." Well, in Matthew chapter 20, that gets a makeover. It's not the disciples, James and John, who ask for these positions of power and prominence. They don't ask the inappropriate question, but rather Matthew has their mother asking the question on behalf of her boys. So those are some of the ways in which these details within the larger telling of the story get changed to improve the presentation of Jesus and the presentation of disciples as well.
Did Matthew embellish the miracles of Jesus in Mark, found in Mark? Like, for instance, instead of 2 blind men being healed, now it's 4 of them.
Yeah. Well, we certainly have more healing stories, more miracle stories in Matthew than in Mark. Both the individual scenes, where Jesus encounters a particular person for healing, as well as the summary scenes, where they brought everybody to Jesus and he healed everybody. So we certainly get more of that in Matthew. And the example one of the examples that you refer to is Mark chapter 10, where we have the healing of blind Bartimaeus, which in the end of Matthew chapter 20 becomes a healing of 2 blind men, not named. The name Bartimaeus disappears, but we get 2 blind men who are healed. But I think what is really important about those healing stories and the exorcism stories and the feeding stories is that they all occur in the framework of that commission that I mentioned from Matthew chapter 1, that Jesus is to manifest God's saving presence in his action. And that commission, as I've suggested, frames the whole of the gospel, including these miracle stories, which I think raises the question as to the prevalence of the brokenness and the demon possession as the context rather, in which God's saving presence is manifested. So why so much brokenness? Why so much possession? And I think we have to look to the circumstances of sickness and disease and demon possession as a reflection of and as a consequence of assertions of Roman power. This is the damage that Roman power creates: food insecurity, poor nutrition, diseases of contagion and deficiency, the impact of stress, the impact of manual labor, ignorance of basic hygiene. I mean, this is just a toxic mix for widespread sickness and disease all over the place. And likewise with the exorcisms. Way back in chapter 4, in the temptation or the testing scene, where the devil challenges Jesus' identity as the Son of God and says, look, I want you to do these 3 things. And of course, if you do them, then you actually become a son of the devil rather than a son of God, because the son is fundamentally about being obedient. You'll be obedient to me. And one of the things that the devil offers to Jesus, if you just fall down and worship him, is to have control of all the empires of the world. So the devil has the power. The devil has these empires in its power and has the power to hand them over to Jesus. So not surprisingly, in the gospel, we see plenty of activity of demons who are active amongst the population. And so Jesus' healings, Jesus' feedings, Jesus' exorcisms are signs of this divine will and purpose, the saving presence that he is to manifest for good life. But that points to another larger dimension. In passages like Isaiah 25 and Isaiah 35, we have visions of what the world looks like when God's reign and purposes are established. In Isaiah 25, there's a vision of a great big feast of good food, rich food, in which everybody participates. In Isaiah 35, there are visions of a healed world where there's no sickness. Texts contemporary with Matthew, like 4th Ezra and 2 Baruch, envision the same sort of thing of a newly created world, which is marked by health and by abundant food and fertility. So I think the miracles and these healings anticipate and they point to that future completion of the divine purposes, and they sort of provide to go with the food metaphor, they provide a foretaste of what that world might look like and how it's experienced.
How do you see the gospel interacting with the Roman Empire?
I think we have a number of interactions with that empire. As I said, it's pervasive. It doesn't go away. Sometimes it pervades the gospel story. I've sometimes heard interpreters say, well, the Roman Empire's got nothing to do with the gospel because the gospel doesn't ever mention it, or hardly ever mentions it except occasionally. And I think that's a wee bit like saying in our own world, the only time that capitalism exists is when I use my credit card. And when I don't use my credit card, capitalism just goes away. Well, we all know that's not true. That's ridiculous. Capitalism is the very structure of our world and society. And I think it's exactly the same thing with the Roman Empire, even when it's not explicitly mentioned. I think it's pervasive and present. So a couple of examples. As I've already mentioned, this commissioning, Jesus is commissioned to manifest God's will and presence as Emmanuel, as Jesus. But that commission both imitates and challenges a very similar commission that the great god Jupiter gives to the Roman Empire in Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, that Jupiter appoints Rome to manifest the will of the gods, to manifest the presence of the gods amongst people. So we've got a very clear parallel and a very clear interaction there. Even though Rome is not mentioned in that commission, I think it's evoked. Likewise, what I've just talked about in terms of the sick folks who are healed. This isn't just razzle-dazzle in the gospel. It's the sick folks are a casualty, as I've suggested, of Roman power. And the healing of them is a repair of Roman power, rolling back of that damage. Or the judgment scene in Matthew chapter 25, the sheep and the goats, where there is one question for the judgment of the nations. How have you cared for the vulnerable and the broken in your midst? And it's quite a catalogue. Those who are food insecure, those who without adequate housing, without adequate clothing, who are sick, who are in prison. I mean, it's quite a catalogue of folks who are subject to the damage of the empire. Or the material around the return of Jesus, who will return to establish to establish the empire of God in the place of the Roman Empire. I mean, those are just some quick examples of sorts of ways in which this Roman power pervades the gospel. But in terms of its teaching for disciples, for readers, how are they to negotiate this empire on a daily basis? How are they to live in it? Well, partly they're to obey it. They're to accommodate to it. So we've got teaching about paying taxes. Yes, you pay your taxes. But the way that the gospel sets that up, there's sort of a relativizing of this act of paying taxes. Paying taxes was a way of acknowledging Roman sovereignty and submitting to it. But of course, Jesus says in that very ambiguous saying, yeah, pay to Rome the things that are Rome's, and pay to God the things that are God's. And folks for 2,000 years have puzzled over what's the interaction between those two clauses. Does everything belong to Rome? Does everything belong to God? If everything belongs to God, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, according to Psalm 24, then what does that say about Rome's demands? However we work that out, there's certainly a relativizing of any absolute claims that Rome has. So there's some accommodation, but it's not exactly total submission either. Followers of Jesus are to be about repairing imperial damage. They're to continue Jesus' works with healings and feedings. They're to be a community of love, of mercy, of taking care. They're to be a welcoming and inclusive community in the midst. They're to embrace an alternative identity that is marked by loyalty to Jesus. That again relativizes the claims that Rome wants to make. They're also to mimic imperial practices. I mean, there's a whole range of strategies here. That command that we get at the end of the gospel, go into the world and make disciples of all nations, that's an incredibly imperializing commission. To make disciples, to submit everybody to the empire of God. And of course, then there's the eschatological material in the gospel, this anticipation of the future establishment of God's empire, which is going to destroy Rome's empire. So there's this fantasy of destruction and punishment and revenge that the gospel stokes. And in the midst of all of this, they're not to engage in any violence. That's God's prerogative. So a bunch of different perspectives there, both on the gospel and the way that followers of Jesus are to live within it.
Throughout the commentary, you include essays at the end of each chapter that attend to aspects of the history of interpretation of that particular chapter. What's the contribution of these essays to the interpretation of the gospel?
Yeah, this was a really fun part about writing the commentary. Really interesting work to do there. But this attention to aspects of the history of interpretation of the gospel is a feature of this Illuminations series. And so the brief is that for each chapter, I was to write an essay that discussed some aspect of that chapter as it's been interpreted in some way at some points over the last 2 millennia. Now, obviously, you can't be comprehensive because you could write a book on just about every section of the gospel, let alone every chapter. So you've got to make some choices. So in these essays, I chose something that I found interesting or quirky or unusual, interesting, and I engaged a range of media in terms of interpretive practices, engaging different cultures, various time periods. So there's discussion of paintings and artwork. There are ancient and modern sermons. There's a children's sermon. There are hymns. There are all sorts of different methodologies that I engage: disability studies, feminist approaches, moral injury approaches, anti-Jewish interpretations. I engage, for example, in chapter 18, which has a lot of material about forgiveness. I engage a lot of contemporary discussion in pastoral care literature, where folks have taken up this command to forgive and have troubled it. Is it always a good command? In what circumstances might forgiveness be offered? In what circumstances might forgiveness be withheld? So I engage some of that pastoral discussion. I do some selected moments in the history of the interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. I look at some paintings in relation to the massacre of the innocents, the Herod's destruction, killing of the babies in chapter 2. The calling of Matthew as a follower of Jesus, which is just one verse in chapter 9, has really provoked a lot of artistic interpretations. And so I discuss 2 paintings, one by Caravaggio, one by Terbruggen, that take 2 quite different approaches to the representation of that scene. Herod's birthday party and the beheading of John the Baptist has also provoked a lot of interpretive activity. So I have a discussion of that, discussion of Mary Magdalene in chapter 27, discussion of Pilate's hand washing in the Passion narrative as well. So all of that is in the service of recognizing diverse interpretations of the material in different media and in various circumstances across 2,000 years. And this interpretation that I offer stands in continuity with that interpretive practice and tradition.
How does Matthew's gospel portray Jesus' opponents?
The quick answer is in a very nasty way. This is one of the big ironies of the gospel, that for all its attention to instructions on love, even for enemies, on mercy, on compassion, of inclusive communities, apparently there are limits. And in the treatment of the opponents, there's some pretty nasty stuff here. These opponents are primarily the societal elites, and they comprise agents of Roman power. So the first one we bump into is King Herod in chapter 2, and then his son Herod Antipas with the beheading of John, and then of course the governor Pilate who executes Jesus. So we have these Roman figures, but we also have their allies, the Jerusalem-based Jewish leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. Now that's the collection of folks that the gospel goes after as its opponents. So a couple of key points about them. This is the power group. This is the ruling group. They're allied together in a societal hierarchy that benefits them, and they protect their own position and their own benefits. We often think of chief priests and Pharisees, Sadducees and scribes as religious leaders. Well, they had some religious responsibilities and commitments, but they weren't like modern day clergy. They were societal leaders. The Jewish historian Josephus talks about the chief priests as being the rulers of Judea. So they exercise not just religious, but also socio-political power, but they do so at the permission of and tolerance of Rome, with a very clear understanding that as long as they pursue Rome's interests and maintain the Rome-dominated status quo, then they can stay in power. But if they don't, they're going to get removed. And so we see in the first century Roman governors appointing and firing chief priests. We see several governors wanting to possess the chief priestly garments and keep them in the Antonia fortress next to the temple. So when the chief priest wants to do his chief priestly thing, he has to go next door and ask to get dressed. These, of course, are ways of reminding local rulers, local leaders of their dependence on Rome. This was a common practice that Rome exercised throughout the empire. It wanted to make alliances with local leaders and rulers as long as they were interested in cooperating with Roman power. So the gospel is very hostile towards these folks. They sort of take a mix and match approach. Sometimes we have Pharisees and scribes, sometimes we have Pharisees and Sadducees, sometimes we have chief priests and scribes, but fundamentally they're all opponents, and the gospel is after them from day one. So in chapter 2, we get Herod, Rome-appointed, Rome-sanctioned king, who is out to kill Jesus. And in the process, he calls his allies, the chief priests and scribes. This is the first time they're mentioned in the gospel. He wants to know where this infant Jesus, who is reputed to be born King of the Jews, where he might find him. The chief priests come up with, and scribes come up with a reference from Micah, and they sort of say to him, well, you might try there. But they don't go off to Bethlehem to find this child. They don't go off to pay any honoring to him. They simply disappear from the scene. So immediately they are tagged negatively as not knowing how to interpret the scriptures in relation to Jesus and not doing anything about obeying the scriptures. And of course, the rest of that chapter 2 is just bad news for Herod, having called his allies, these Jerusalem leaders. He then says to the Magi, I want you to go off to Bethlehem, find the child, come back and tell me. So he turns the Magi into spies. And he says to them, come back and tell me, so I too might go and honor him. So we've got lies now in terms of what Herod is doing. They all rhyme nicely, allies, spies, and lies. And then when all of that doesn't work out, he resorts to infanticides and kills the infants 2 years old and under. I mean, this is a scathing attack on a Rome-appointed client king. In the very next chapter, in chapter 3, the Pharisees and the Sadducees combine, and they come to John the Baptist, who is baptizing and is going to bear witness to Jesus, and they come against John's baptism. Now, it's often translated as they come for baptism, but with all the antagonism, that's a very unlikely translation, and the Greek construction happily is capable of rendering as they come against John's baptism. So immediately, Pharisees and Sadducees are on the wrong side of what God is doing in the world. And throughout the gospel, these folks can't get anything right. They can't do anything right. So they have a fight in chapter 12 over how the Sabbath is to be honored. This is a really big question and a really important question. The first scene in chapter 12, we have Pharisees hiding out in a grain field. checking out whether anybody is going to take a few heads of grain and have a grain bar to eat as a snack. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Pharisees were not hiding out in grain fields to check up on people. So there's a bit of mocking and satire going on here. But then Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, and they're upset about this. Is this just because they are sort of prickly individuals? No, not at all. I mean, we've got a major theological debate going on here about how the Sabbath is to be observed. Both Jesus and the Pharisees want to observe Sabbath. The question is how to do it. And the Pharisees' argument is basically, if it's good enough for God to rest on the Sabbath, if that's how important the day is, if that's how holy it is, then humans should desist from all work as well. That's a pretty powerful argument. And against it, Jesus says, well, Sabbath is about doing good and about doing mercy, which is also a powerful argument, and they lock horns over that. Things get nasty. In both chapters 16 and 19, the Pharisees and Sadducees come to Jesus to test him or to tempt him. That's exactly the same verb that's used for the devil back in chapter 4, who tests or tempts Jesus. So the gospel has now allied them with the devil, and they become agents of the devil in resisting God's agent. Chapter 23, Jesus announced woes on the scribes and Pharisees. Woes are simply a way of speaking condemnation. 7 times he curses them. It's basically a way of saying, go to hell. This is vicious, and clearly the stakes are high in this fight. And I think contemporary readers have to be very aware that what we're reading at this point in the gospel is polemic. This is not factual reporting. This is not indifferent, unbiased, just the facts. No, that's the last thing it is. It's part of the gospel's agenda to make Jesus look good and his opponents look bad. It's polemic. It has an agenda. And, the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, chief priests have their own definitions of faithfulness in the service of God. So they deserve respect, even when the gospel does not always offer it to them. And I think at times we need to read against the grain, so to speak.
Does Matthew portray Jesus as the new Moses?
Yeah, this is a common interpretation and claim that interpreters have made to describe Jesus' activity, especially in these 5 big blocks of teaching material that I mentioned, 5 through 7, 10, 13, 18, 24, 25. And some folks have gone far enough to say that, we've got a new Pentateuch here because we've got 5 blocks of material. And I think runs into problems because we've got to take chapter 23 into account as well, which 6 into 5 doesn't quite go. I'm not particularly a fan of this description of Jesus as a new Moses for 2 reasons. First of all, it's often used in a way that implies and sometimes openly asserts that Jesus has replaced or usurped or is superior to Moses. And I don't think that's a particularly helpful or sustaining way of interpreting the material. In the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus doesn't abolish the teaching of Moses. He doesn't say in chapter 5, murder is fine, but just don't get angry. He doesn't say that. He goes with the command not to murder and points to often its root in anger. One could say that's a radicalizing of it, or one could simply say it's a way of recognizing that murder is often, not always, but often rooted in anger. So be careful about what you do with your anger. He doesn't abolish the teaching against adultery, but he does say, be careful with lust. Be careful that you lust after, because that's the root, that's the foundation. So in chapter 19, when the rich guy comes to Jesus and says, how might I gain life of the age, or eternal life in the new age? How do I get there? Jesus says to him, well, you need to obey the commands that have to do with social interactions in the Decalogue. So don't be murdering, don't be committing adultery, don't be stealing or bearing false witness. Oh, and by the way, you ought to love your neighbor, borrowing from Leviticus 19. Oh, and a number of passages in the Hebrew Bible, you should divest yourself of your wealth and give to the poor. Nothing there about faith in Jesus, but upholding the obedience to the teaching of Moses. So if Jesus is a new Moses, and again, I'm not particularly happy with the description, he's a Moses very much in line with Moses, and an interpreter of Moses. There's much more continuity there than there is discontinuity, which is how it's often presented. And some interpreters want that discontinuity so to sort of heighten Christian superiority. You know, Jesus is the greatest and the best, and Moses sort of is very much comes second. And I don't think that's a fair interpretation of the gospel, and I don't think it's a charitable interpretation either. So that's one reason I'm not very happy with it. The second reason is this, that there is a good link between Moses and Jesus, in that both are founding figures of a group of people. And I'd rather see continuity than discontinuity in the relationship between the two. So we can talk about Moses and Jesus rather than Moses and a new Moses. Let's recognize both figures. But being founding figures and founding a community, a new constitution or societal practice was quite common in the ancient world. You know, with the Spartan Lycurgus, we have Solon of Athens, we have Dionysius of Halicarnassus, we have Augustus of Rome, just to name a few. Of course, Jesus is not quoting any of them, but his teaching has a similar function of securing identity and constructing a way of life. And so recognizing Jesus in that larger cultural context and tradition, I think, is appropriate. And if we only zoom in on Moses, then we fail to see that both Moses and Jesus are doing something that has much larger cultural settings and appropriateness.
Did Matthew suggest that the Jews are to be blamed forever for Jesus' death?
One word answer, no. I know that this is something that interpreters have claimed for a very long time from this gospel. It's often been asserted. We've got this long tradition of anti-Judaism, Jews as the Christ killers, all Jews for all time, rooted in Christian triumphalism and supersessionism, which has removed Jewish folks from the divine purposes. This is something that we must not continue, and we need to repent of in Christian traditions. The Catholic Church renounced this claim in the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, 1965, a document In Nostra Aetate, where they renounced any such understandings. And various denominations since have followed with similar denunciations of those claims. A couple of factors to keep in mind. Jews did not have the right to exercise the death penalty, maybe with one exception, but generally did not have the right to exercise the death penalty in the first century. Jesus is crucified by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. I think that's very clear in the narratives. Pilate has the power to put Jesus to death, and Pilate exercises that power. Now, I know that in a lot of Christian circles, Pilate is regarded as a wimp, and the big bad nasty Jewish leaders twist his arm up his back and force him to crucify Jesus. I think that's about as far wrong as it's possible to get an interpretation. You didn't get to be a governor in the Roman system if you were a wimp. You got to be a governor because you had been tested in battle, in military enterprise, and you had been tested in civic administration. And you didn't get appointed unless you had shown that you had the abilities to exercise this particular role. Now, I think Pilate was competent, if not always particularly wise. And we have some other incidents about Pilate that suggest that he didn't always act sensitively and wisely. But in the gospel stories, he knows that if his allies, the folks he rules with in Jerusalem, he has to be in alliance with them. If they want someone executed, then it's up to him to do something about this threat, to take it seriously. But there's a power game going on here. He can't be a governor when his allies come to him and say, we want this guy taken out on a cross. And he just says, okay, you flick your fingers, I jump. No Roman governor is going to do that. So in this alliance with local ruling Jewish folks in Jerusalem, there's a tensive power battle that goes on. And I think Pilate governs pretty astutely in the gospel scenes, where he turns the power dynamic back on these folks, and he makes them beg. And so all these questions that we get in the Passion narrative about, oh, what evil has he done? I don't see that he's done anything evil. Why should I crucify him? Which puts them immediately in a position of having to beg him, to be reminded that they're dependent on him, that he has the power over them. I think it's a pretty successful day's ruling, actually, and governing on Pilate's part. And of course, he polls the crowd as well. If I crucify this guy who is known as King of the Jews, which is a seditious title and merits the death penalty in the Roman view of things. You could only be a king of the Jews if Rome appointed you to be, and Jesus certainly wasn't. If I'm going to execute this guy, what sort of fallout is there going to be? How many followers does he have? Am I going to have mass riots on my hands? And by asking these questions of the crowd also, he soon learns that there's not a lot of support for Jesus. I think that's pretty astute. So Jesus is crucified as King of the Jews just as Herod was appointed as King of the Jews by Rome. So I think this is an indication that Pilate is not the weak wimp who's being manipulated and who's a fool and who doesn't have any character or any backbone. Not at all. He's taking care of a threat to Roman power. This is a guy who's raised crowds, who's walked around talking about another empire, who's criticized the ruling elites in their temple. He's predicted that he's going to return and establish God's reign, God's empire, with himself as a king. I mean, you're checking all the boxes here for execution. And that's what Pilate carries out. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing, of course, is we have this very difficult verse in chapter 27, where the crowd shouts, his blood be on us and on our children. And this has often been interpreted as this indication that Jews are Christ killers for all time. I think there are several things to be said about it. Notice that it follows in verse 24 where Pilate washes his hands, which is a cleansing of pollutant, of dealing with a figure who has brought about disorder and is now sentenced to death. And he tells the crowd, see to it yourselves. Well, that's exactly what they can't do. They can't see to it themselves. So they claim responsibility in an expression of colonized identity as rebels. And they take responsibility for being associated with Jesus. In other words, he's one of us. And so we're guilty by association. We're assumed to be allied with a rebel. And now in the presence of the Roman governor, they choose to express loyalty to Rome, which is a fairly pragmatic and very easily understood decision. But it's only one crowd in Jerusalem. We know that there are several crowds in Jerusalem from the gospel story. It's not all Jewish people everywhere for all time. And the link to the inclusion of be upon us and on our children places limits on the next generation, on the extent of any consequences. And interpreters have often linked that to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 as punishment in that particular way. So again, we've got to be very careful with this claim. It's the Roman governor who carries out the execution, and it's a claim by a particular Jewish crowd that is not a crowd that represents all Jews for all time in all places.
My last question. Where did Mark and Matthew agree and disagree about the resurrection account?
So we're right at the end of both Gospels. They agree that Jesus has been raised from the dead. They agree that Rome couldn't keep him dead. They agree that God's life-giving power is greater than the death-bringing power of Rome. So that's what they agree on. But it's narrated in some quite different ways. And the obvious difference is that for Mark, it all happens in 8 verses, the original ending of the gospel. Matthew has 20 verses, so it's a longer and more complex story in Matthew. The next piece of agreement is that in both accounts, the women come to the tomb. They agree on that. However, they disagree on why. In Mark's version of the story, the women bring spices to anoint a dead body. They come expecting somebody to be dead, Jesus. But in Matthew, there's no reference to spices at all. They don't come with spices, but rather they come, quote, to see the tomb. And this verb seeing can be used in Matthew's gospel for literal sight, for literal seeing, but it can also be used for insight, for understanding. And I think the absence of the spices in Matthew's gospel and the use of this verb indicates that they come expecting to see Jesus be raised. They've heard Jesus predict that on the 3rd day he will be raised, so they come expecting to see him alive. They've heard his predictions, that's their expectation. That's a very big difference in the 2 accounts. Both accounts agree that there's an encounter with an angelic heavenly figure who announces to them that Jesus has been raised and sends them off to tell the male disciples to go to Galilee. So there's agreement there. And they go. But in Mark, the women flee in terror. They say nothing. They're terrified. This is this ending of the gospel that subsequent editings tried to revise and make a whole lot better than fleeing in fear. And Matthew certainly expands in that way. As they go, they encounter the risen Jesus, they touch him, they take hold of his feet, and he renews this commission from the angelic figure, go and tell the male disciples to go to Galilee. So that's where Mark ends. That's where Mark runs out. No more story in the original ending of Mark. But Matthew carries on with 2 more scenes. The first scene in verses 11 through 15 tells an alternative story to explain what has happened. It shows the ruling imperial figures have been outpowered by God, so what do? And the scene exposes tactics, strategies of ruling elites, and of course it does so in a very negative way. They're going to resort to lies and bribes and deception. They're going to bribe the soldiers to say, we fell asleep, but with no penalty, because falling asleep on duty is very much a capital offence. But, you know, we're going to let you off with this fake story, and we're going to offer you a bribe, and you're going to play along. No penalty. And they're going to say the disciples stole the body. That explains why there is no body around. So that's the imperial alternative story. Then at verse 16, Matthew's chapter takes up the scene in Galilee. The disciples have been told, they've heard the proclamation from the faithful women, he is alive, he wants to meet you in Galilee. So the disciples have believed the proclamation, the male disciples, the 11 of them, because Judas is no longer among them. They've gone to Galilee, and there they encounter the risen Jesus, both with honor and with doubt. Jesus announces himself as having all authority in heaven and earth, which is a huge claim, and then commissions them, sends them on a worldwide mission to make disciples of all nations. This is a very imperial, mimicked, imperial imitated commission to make disciples of all nations, baptizing and teaching, and promises to be with them in this task that is to continue to the end of this age, that will lead to participation in the new age. So the gospel kind of bookends itself with promises of divine presence. We had the promise of Emmanuel back in chapter 1, with the angel's message to Joseph in the reading from Isaiah, Emmanuel, and we end up with a repeating of the promise, I'll be with you always to the end of the age.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick before we close, the link to purchase both volumes of Warren's commentary on Matthew will be in the description below and the pinned comment. And with that being said, Warren, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jacob, for having me. I really appreciate the conversation.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.